This is Dominissimo Voxlore, transmitting on frequencies older than the stars themselves. In this broadcast, we draw you into the silence of eternity, to awaken beside the legions of the Undying, the Necrons. It is not merely the tale of a Xenos race, but of a dynasty forged in the war in heaven, of souls traded for immortality, of kings who rise from tombs that slumbered for 60 million years. Strike the seal of subscription, or be consigned to dust with the fleeting empires of flesh. Still your breath, still your soul, and heed this decree. This is the voice of Dominissimo, and this is the law of the Necrons. A civilization shaped by perpetual death. This was the legacy of the Necrontyr, ancient beings born under a star's lethal gaze. Their world, bathed in ionising radiation, left their people cursed with agonisingly fleeting lives. From cradle to grave, every Necrontyr was acutely aware. Life was ruinously short, and mortality all too certain. Their cities reflected this morbid foresight. Tombs dominated the skyline, while the living occupied transient dwellings. Cities crafted more for the departed than the living. Legacy, rather than life itself, became their obsession. The looming question consumed them. How could they conquer the void when each of their days was numbered? Driven by desperation to escape death's grip, the Necrontyr turned toward the stars. Yet unlike the warp-faring old ones, their ships sailed painfully slow. Encasing themselves in living metal called necrodermis, they voyaged across the stars in stasis crypts on sluggish starlight vessels. Colonising distant worlds offered no comfort, only brief reprieves from mortality's shadow. Amid their interstellar struggle, the Necrontyr stumbled across the Old Ones, ancient architects of the galaxy and the creators of younger races like the Eldar. Their encounter was poison. Here were beings ageless, powerful and psychically gifted, everything the Necrontyr weren't. Envy turned cruelly to hatred, and resentment shaped itself into war. This conflict, the war in heaven, raged across eons. The Necrontyr starships battered at the Old Ones' strongholds, but their technological prowess failed before the Old Ones' command of the warp and their secreted webway network. Humanity's distant ancestors, the Necrontyr, were driven back again and again, cornered among the halo stars, dismissed as nothing more than cosmic nuisance. Yet in that crucible of desperation, the Necrontyr discovered something far more ancient than themselves, the Catan. Born from the primordial fury of stars, these star-born entities existed as pure cosmic energy. Their presence was incomprehensible, vast, intangible and hungering for power. The Necrontyr, starving for advantage, offered these beings physical forms, bodies forged from necrodermis, shaped to house cosmic intelligences. Thus were the star gods, Catan, given armour of fleshless metal. In their newfound form, the Catan discovered a taste for something more intimate than solar death, the living essence of their channelers. That deadly alliance changed everything. The Catan granted the Necrontyr weapons of unimaginable might and promised them immortality, both lies whispered alongside the thrill of vengeance. However, it was a deception spun of exquisite cruelty. For the Necrontyr, the promised immortality came through biotransference. Their minds transferred into necrodermis bodies, their flesh cast aside. They became Necrons, undying, soulless machines. But in that exchange, their souls were devoured. The Catan gorged on their life essence as they forged the Necron shells. Only a few retained their self-awareness. The rest became legions of puppet warriors, soulless and relentless. This was the dawn of something terrible, spoken of in tales as the genesis of the Necrons, and it began here, in the gloomy cradle of evacuated hearts and cosmic despair. The stars themselves trembled when the Necrontyr brought their war to the Old Ones. A conflict of unimaginable scale that would fracture reality and shape the destiny of every sapient species to come. This was the war in heaven, an age of cosmic ruin and pyrrhic triumph, where primal energies and ancient destinies collided. Empowered by the Catan, the Necrontyr rediscovered the momentum of war. Advance after advance they pressed into the webway itself, turning the Old One's greatest fortress into a maze of terror. Through dolmen gates, portals of living stone, they laid siege to enemy bastions and began to exact revenge in ways previously unthinkable. Entire suns were snuffed out, civilizations were erased in nova light, planets were harvested not for conquest but as offerings to ravenous cosmic beings. The Necrons, born of biotransference in the fires of living metal, were godlike, soulless, remorseless, and reshaped in horror and ambition beyond imagining. The Old Ones, panicked and dying, turned to their creations for salvation. They engineered new races, such as the Eldar, Krork, Roshan, and other psychic warriors strong enough to channel stirrings in the immaterium. These younger races became weapons of the Old Ones, recapturing ground and sanity through psychic resistance. But in feeding their war, they unleashed catastrophic consequences. As psychic energy spilled into the warp, they awakened sprawling horrors. the Enslaver Plague, entities that thrived on psychic pain and feed through domination. These parasites tore open the veil between worlds, pouring terror into reality and shattering the Old One's final defences from within. In that shattered moment, the Catan grew complacent. Their victory was near, the galaxy was crumbling in their grasp, and yet their hubris became their downfall. The Silent King, Sautekh, had waited through the cataclysm. When the star gods were weary and divided, he struck. Ancient arcana and psionic technique merged with the Necron engineering to forge weapons that defied any conception of power, god-killing hypercannons. In a single volcanic surge, Sautekh shattered the Catan. Once immortal beings, woven from the threads of creation itself, fractured into innumerable shards. These broken fragments were bound within multiverse-spanning prisons, tesseract labyrinths, traps that ensured no Catan could reform. In those decisive moments, the war in heaven ended. The Old Ones were gone, either exterminated or scattered into exile. The star gods lay imprisoned, their reign of terror sundered by betrayal, and the Necrontyr were no more. From their ashes rose the Necrons, a new race of living metal, soulless, eternal, and stripped of past weaknesses. Yet even the hollow victory bore its own wounds. The cost of rebellion had been paid in countless legions of Necrons. Millions perished in the cataclysm. All that remained to rule were those who survived the betrayal, Sautekh among them. The war had been won, but the price had been of the soul of a race. The galaxy lay in hushed ruins, haunted by the echoes of cosmic war. The war in heaven was not a chapter to be told. It was a scarring of time itself, a turning of worlds. Its legacy endured in broken stars, ruined tomb worlds, and the silent metallic warriors who waited their next chance to rise. For in the hush after war, time itself became the tactic of the Necrons, their immortality now both their strength and their burden. By the end of the war in heaven, the galaxy lay ashen and broken. The Old Ones were extinguished or scattered into exile, the star gods, the Catan, had been shattered, and the war-weary Necrons had found themselves masters of a ravaged universe. Yet their triumph was empty, echoing hollow across the cosmic graveyard left behind. The galaxy was not yet theirs, not in this epoch. The living races they had once thought so frail still persisted. The Eldar had emerged triumphant survivors of the cataclysm, and the Immaterium brimmed with unchecked psychic horrors. The Silent King, Sautekh, saw that the time for Necron dominion had not yet come. Thus began an age of patience, an era of silence that would stretch across real space and millennia, the Great Sleep. Sautekh issued his final command. Necron tomb cities were transformed into planetary mausoleums, tomb worlds, vast necropoli where countless Necron legions were interred into immobilised ranks. Deep within these worlds, status crypts nestled like veins of living metal, each crypt a silent sarcophagus holding a Necron in suspended animation. The technologies of maintenance and preservation pulsed through the underground citadels, ensuring that the legions slept undisturbed, preserved indefinitely in living metal, immune to decay, impervious to pain. These tomb complexes were sealed off from the stars, sundered from the surface, and placed under ceaseless surveillance by canoptic constructs, unyielding machines of service and defence. Why this long slumber? The Silent King's logic was chillingly pragmatic. First, the warp had torn reality asunder during the war in heaven. Its psychic storm still raged unchecked. The galaxy teemed with the twisted energies and demonic scourge, posing threats even to the soulless Necrons. Second, the Eldar, those masters of the soul, had risen in strength and would inherit all the Old Ones had abandoned. Battling them immediately with weakened legions would court disaster. The only rational path was to withdraw, wait out the psychic chaos, let the devastation of chaos subside, allow new races to rise and fall, and watch the Eldar fade under the slow attrition of fate. Then, when the era of flesh had passed, the Necrons would awaken, resurgent, undying, ruling a healed galaxy ripe for reclamation. Thus the command echoed across every tomb city. Sleep for 60 million standard years, and awaken only when the stars themselves had cooled and the cycles of life had turned enough in their favour. Sautekh's voice did not echo in the halls of command forever. In his final decree, before sealing the tomb worlds, he destroyed the engrammatic protocols that bound Necron wills to himself. It was both atonement and liberation. He had failed as people once, he vowed never to use that absolute power again. And so, with no commands left to give, he vanished, leaving his people to dream in silence while he drifted into the uncharted void of intergalactic space. For 60 million years, time flowed above the silent crypts. Beneath endless sands, the Necrons lay in unbroken stillness. Above ground, the galaxy's tapestry rewove itself. Civilizations flourished and collapsed. The Eldar peaked and splintered. Humanity rose and forged empires bound by faith and steel. Chaos raged unchecked. Whole stars were born and died, but the Necrons did not stir. Their dreamless sleep endured beyond the measure of mortal memory. Slowly, however, even soulless perfection could not resist the entropy of ages. Some tomb worlds faltered, stasis crypt chronostats misaligned, star-powered engines hiccuped. Maintenance cores degraded, catastrophe followed technical failure, cascade collapses, destroyed entire tomb complexes, snuffing out legions forever. Others fell victim to star explosions, cosmic accidents, or deliberate interdiction. Eldar raiders, recalling ancient vengeance, razed some tombs before the slumbering could awaken. Yet the vast majority endured, concealed and preserved, waiting. When the stars of the 41st millennium aligned, the Necrons began to awaken, but not in unison. A handful, by malfunction or design, woke prematurely, emerging into a galaxy still shaped by early human expansion and war. These early risers formed a covert circle among themselves, negotiating the chaos of their return under a makeshift leadership called the Awaken Council, acting as caretakers until the Silent King returned, and bringing order where disarray threatened to shatter those first fragile steps towards rebirth. Most, however, remained deeply slumbering through the ages, surfacing only when the fabric of the galaxy had settled into the age of the Imperium. The Great Sleep was not a peaceful absence. For each tomb world that failed to survive, generations of Necron warriors and overlords were lost forever. But enough legions endured, enough dynasties survived entombment intact to rekindle the Infinite Empire's dream. As the Awakened looked towards the stars, they no longer saw relics of ancient wars, they saw opportunity. The galaxy had grown bloated with the hubris of young species and fractured by the warp's wounds. It was ripe for reclamation, if only they could reassemble the tumbling fragments of their empire from the crypts of time. Time had been the Silent King's weapon, and it had waited until the conditions were ripe. When the moment came, the Necrons would rise, not as desperate survivors of eons past, but as the silent, remorseless masters of eternity. When the first tomb world stirred fully awake, the galaxy did not notice. Their canaptic guardians had laboured faithfully during the long slumber, tending crypts and resetting cycles of stasis. When their lords rose, it was to silence, a universe changed beyond recognition. The stars they remembered were still there, but their maps were alien. Empires of flesh sprawled across their ancient dominions. The Necrons had slept for 60 million years, and in that time, frailty had flourished. Where once the Old Ones ruled, now the galaxy belonged to others, to Eldar remnants, to swarming orcs, and most disturbingly, to humanity. At first, the Awakenings were cautious, the dynasties testing their strength in secrecy. Yet as more crypts opened and more overlords rose, their presence could no longer remain hidden. The galaxy was about to rediscover an enemy that had been ancient before its first dreams of civilization. The earliest clash remembered by the Imperium came upon a lonely desert planet, Sanctuary 101. To the Adeptus Oratos who kept their covenant there, the barren world was nothing more than a place of vigil. Beneath the sands, however, lay an ancient tomb complex of the Necrons. In the year 897.M41, the silence broke. At first it was subtle, static whispers in vox lines, pick feeds clouding with pale green interference. Then the earth itself convulsed, and skeletal warriors of living metal rose in relentless ranks. Their gorse flares unleashed coruscating beams of emerald light that stripped flesh molecule by molecule. The sisters fought bravely, hymns to the Emperor ringing out against the mechanical chorus of war, but valour could not stand against technology older than humanity's very sun. When Imperial relief forces arrived, they found only silence, a covenant of the dead, and bodies grotesquely flayed in mockery of life. The massacre of Sanctuary 101 was the Imperium's first undeniable record of the Necrons, and it was etched in horror. From there, reports multiplied. Imperial survey teams vanished without trace on frontier colonies. Worlds long thought cursed revealed themselves as tomb planets where skeletal warriors rose from beneath the bedrock. Outposts cut off from the astropathic relay were found littered with corpses, their attackers unseen. Survivors spoke of enemies that dissolved under fire only to reassemble moments later, as if death itself could not claim them. To the unprepared Imperium, it was like fighting phantoms, foes that could not be reasoned with, could not be cowed, and would not die. The Imperium's first true campaigns against the Necron forces taught grim lessons. Bolter shells crumpled against Necrodermis carapaces, lasfire fizzled, and even plasma struggled to bite. The Necrons advanced in perfect silence, disciplined and methodical, immune to fatigue or fear. Worst of all were their reanimation protocols, fallen warriors dissolving into crackling green light, only to reappear fully restored in the heart of their tomb complexes. It was though every battlefield defeat was temporary, each slain legionnaire destined to rise again and again until the living exhausted themselves. To the Imperium, it was a war against inevitability. The Eldar, long haunted by memories of the war in heaven, recognised the threat before humanity could comprehend it. In their mythologies, the Necrons were Ingir, soulless horrors bound to the star gods, and their awakening filled the Farseers with dread. Eldar strike forces began to move preemptively, destroying tomb worlds where they could, warning Imperial commanders in cryptic riddles. To many human commanders, these warnings seemed little more than xenoparanoia. Only when Imperial troops fought shoulder to shoulder with Eldar against Necron incursions did they begin to understand that the galaxy faced not a new enemy, but the return of its most ancient one. One such example unfolded on the mining world of Damnos. To its inhabitants, it was simply a cold, desolate planet, useful only for the ores beneath its crust. But in the year 973.M41, the ground shook, and tomb complexes awoke in force. Within a year, the planet's defenders were crushed beneath the advancing phalanxes of Necron warriors. Imperial Guard regiments perished in droves, local defences dissolved before the relentless machine tied. When the Ultramarines arrived under Captain Cato Sicarius, it was already too late. Damnos had fallen. Their intervention could only delay the inevitable, saving a fraction of the civilians as the dynasty claimed the world as its own. The Imperium recorded Damnos not only as a defeat, but as a chilling prophecy. Any world might hide a tomb, and at any moment might see its conquest from beneath. Other encounters were stranger still. The Necron overlord known as Trazyn the Infinite emerged from stasis with a hunger not for conquest but for acquisition. To Imperial commanders he was a nightmare of unpredictability, appearing in the midst of battle to unleash captive monstrosities from its galleries or to steal relics deemed irreplaceable. Entire crusades were thrown into disarray by his interventions, though for him it was little more than curating a collection. In contrast, Amrakir the Traveller moved from dynasty to dynasty as an agitator and emissary, sometimes even aiding Imperial forces against Orcs or Tyranids, if it suited his vision of unity among his kind. To the Imperium these encounters sowed confusion. Were the Necrons invaders, collectors, zealots, or saviours of convenience? The truth was all of these and none, for the Necrons were a fractured people bound only by the memory of their lost empire. For the ordinary citizen of the Imperium, tales of the Necrons spread like whispered curses. Some called them the Metal Dead, others the Soulless Ones. Stories circulated of entire regiments slaughtered without a sound, of black monoliths descending from the skies, of gorse beams reducing tanks to skeletons of molten slag. The Inquisition classified them swiftly as a Xenos Majoris threat, their origins shrouded in secrecy to avoid panic. Scholars pieced together fragments of their history from alien ruins and scattered records, realising with dawning horror that this was no new race but a re-emergence of a power that predated the very birth of mankind. Every engagement deepened the Imperium's fear. Necron technology eclipsed theirs in every measurable way. Starships that could phase through the void, weapons that flensed the fabric of reality, constructs capable of repairing themselves endlessly, all arrayed against mortal armies of flesh and steel. Worse still was the silence of it. Other races boasted or raged or screeched in triumph. The Necrons killed without voice, without joy, without malice. To fight them was to fight with the inevitability of death itself, marching forward in emerald light. Yet in these early contacts, one truth saved the Imperium from immediate annihilation. The Necrons were not united. Each dynasty awoke separately, pursuing its own ambitions. Some sought only to reclaim their ancestral worlds, others turned their gaze outward in expansion. Still, others ignored mankind entirely, waging war against rival dynasties in struggles of pride older than human history. For all their might, they lacked cohesion, and this fracture gave humanity a chance to resist. It was a fragile hope, but in the grim darkness of the 41st millennium, even the faintest delay could mean survival. So the Imperium recorded these first battles in blood and fire. Sanctuary 101, Damnos, countless frontier worlds. They became the opening notes of a war yet to come, a prelude to the Necrons' full return. For the dynasties themselves, these awakenings were but tests, the first steps in the long campaign to reclaim what they believed was rightfully theirs. And in the silence between battles, one question loomed over all who had seen the Metal Dead rise from beneath the earth. If this was only the beginning, what horrors would follow when the rest of the Tomb Worlds awoke? The galaxy did not realise the scale of the threat at first. Isolated raids, massacres like Sanctuary 101, and the fall of Damnos seemed nightmarish but limited. To most Imperial commanders, the Necrons were a terrifying but regional menace, akin to Orc warlords or Tyranid splinters. That illusion shattered when the dynasties began to rise in earnest. No longer were the Necrons a scattering of isolated tomb worlds, they were awakening as fractured remnants of a once great empire, each dynasty with its own agenda, its own overlords, and its own dreams of domination. What had begun as scattered awakenings now swelled into tidal resurgence that would reach across the stars. The dynasties were not a single nation reborn, but a mosaic of ancient powers rekindled, each one remembering itself as the rightful heir to eternity. On one world, a pharaoh might stir, awakening legions of warriors and cryptecs who immediately set about rebuilding their territory as though the war in heaven had ended only yesterday. On another, an overlord's personality might be fractured, his memory eroded by the long sleep, leaving him a paranoid tyrant lashing out at all who neared his domain. These fractured awakenings brought variety as much as horror. Some dynasties arose like disciplined armies, marching with mechanical precision, while others emerged as half-mad echoes of the past, unleashing violence without purpose beyond vengeance. Among these powers, certain names spread fear even in the whispers of the Inquisition. The Sautekh dynasty rose under Imhotep the Stormlord, a brilliant commander whose campaigns rivaled even the most storied strategists of mankind. Imhotep waged war with methodical patience, system by system, constructing networks of conquest that left no room for rebellion. Worlds under his gaze were scoured with Gorse fire, their skies blackened with crescent warships, their populations reduced to ash or slavery. His reputation spread quickly. To fight the Stormlord was to face the implacable tide of logic and ruthlessness. He did not waste lives, for he had endless legions of machines to throw into battle. He did not tire, for he was immortal, and he did not forget. For every world that had once been under the Sautekh dominion was now a prize he would reclaim. But Imhotep was not alone. The Mefrit dynasty emerged with a doctrine centred on the power of the stars themselves. Their weapons blazed brighter, fed by stellar radiation, and their ambition was nothing less to harness the very suns as energies of annihilation. When they rose, systems were not simply conquered, they were burned. Whole planets were reduced to lifeless rock, scorched by energies that could strip atmospheres and shatter biospheres. To the Mefrit, extermination was not only strategy but inevitability. Their philosophy saw no value in coexistence with younger races, only in annihilation, and they pursued this with zeal that even other Necron dynasties found excessive. In stark contrast stood the Nihilakh dynasty, whose rulers had survived the Great Sleep with a sense of cold detachment. Their domains were vast, and their ambition was dominion without end. Where the Sautekh sought military supremacy, and the Mefrit thirsted for fire and destruction, and the Nihilakh desired ownership, the slow reclamation of every star system they deemed theirs by ancient right. They awoke not to conquer by fire but to smother with inevitability, expanding their borders with meticulous calculation, binding one world after another into their domain until their influence stretched farther than any other Necron house. Yet not all dynasties rose with coherent agendas. The Maynarch, remembered in hushed tones by the Eldar, awoke as something darker, almost unhinged. Their pharaohs had gone mad in their slumber, and their legions marched with an eerie nihilism, inflicting suffering for its own sake. To encounter the Maynarch was to witness not orderly conquest but sadistic carnage. Their victims were not merely slain but mutilated, their worlds not only harvested but desecrated. Even other Necron overlords whispered unease at the Maynarch's cruelty, recognising in them something that had lost all pretense of purpose beyond despair. Each dynasty clashed not only with the Imperium and the Eldar, but with also each other. Rivalries as old as the war in heaven were not forgotten. Feuds that had lain dormant for 60 million years reignited with brutal intensity. Entire campaigns were fought not to reclaim territory from the younger races, but to settle scores between dynasties. It was not uncommon for an Imperial commander to find two Necron forces annihilating one another, their legions locked in a machine-perfect war, the humans ignored entirely until the victors turned their Gorse flares outward. This intersign conflict was both the Necrons' greatest weakness and the Imperium's only mercy. Had they awakened united, the younger races might have been crushed swiftly beneath their heel. Still, even fractured, the dynasties made their presence felt. For the Imperium, each contact was a disaster measured in worlds lost, regiments annihilated, or sectors destabilised. The Damnos catastrophe became one of such many tales. In the Orpheus sector, Imperial Guard armies vanished as Necron phalanxes emerged, their tomb worlds spilling forth endless soldiers who advanced in perfect silence. Reports trickled back of monolithic war engines blotting out the sun, of constructs that could tear apart cities with a thought, of alien lords who moved with regal certainty as though they were kings reclaiming their thrones from interlopers. Each story was a warning. This was no simple Xenos threat, but the awakening of an empire older than the stars. The Eldar, though more prepared, found themselves equally imperiled. Their ancient hatred of the Necrons reignited as they clashed across maiden worlds and exodite colonies. Craftworld war hosts fought desperate battles to prevent tombs from fully awakening, striking quickly with seer-guided raids to destroy tomb complexes before their legions could march. But each success was fleeting. For every tomb burned, another stirred. For every dynasty slowed, another advanced. To the Eldar, it was the shadow of the war in heaven returned, an echo of an age where the Necrons and the Star Gods had brought ruin to the galaxy. What unified all these encounters was the realisation that the Necrons were not invaders from the outside galaxy. They were its original rulers, its ancient kings, returning to claim what had once been theirs. Each dynasty, no matter how fractured, operated under that conviction. The younger races were trespassers, their empires temporary intrusions upon a galaxy that belonged to the Necrons by ancient decree. Whether through conquest, extermination, or assimilation, the goal was the same: restoration of the infinite empire. As the 41st millennium waned, it became clear that the rise of the dynasties was not a temporary menace. This was the beginning of a long, grinding war of dominion over the galaxy itself. The Imperium, already beset by chaos, orcs, Tyranids, and the endless internal strife, now faced an enemy that could not be bribed, intimidated, or exterminated. The Necrons would not negotiate, they would not relent. They had waited 60 million years for their moment, and now they intended to seize it. The dynasties had risen. Their legions marched once more, and though they bickered and clashed amongst themselves, the truth loomed over every battlefield. Should they ever unite, the galaxy would tremble as it had not since the War in Heaven. The age of the Necrons was not a dream of the past, it was a promise of the future. Across the void between galaxies, in a place where no mortal can hope to survive, a figure of silver and shadow drifted alone. For millennia beyond court, Sautekh, the last Triarch, had wandered in exile. He had abandoned his people at the dawn of the Great Sleep, shattered by the enormity of his betrayal. It was he who had led the Necrontyr into the pact with the Star Gods, he who had commanded the biotransference, and he who had condemned an entire species to hollow immortality. To atone, he destroyed the command protocols that bound every Necron to his own will, and vanished into the intergalactic dark, intent that none should ever again be shackled by his authority. His people would sleep, and he would drift, until purpose called him back. Purpose did come. In the frozen dark, far from the galactic disk, the Silent King encountered a new horror. He witnessed the advance of the Tyranids, extragalactic predators that devoured entire biospheres with mechanical hunger. To Sautekh, their coming was not simply another invasion by an existential threat. If the Tyranids consumed the galaxy entire, there would be no future for the Necrons, no chance to reclaim their empire, no hope to restore their lost flesh. All that had been endured, all that had been sacrificed, would be rendered meaningless. For the first time in millions of years, the Silent King turned his gaze back toward the galaxy he had abandoned. His self-imposed exile ended, and he steered his vast sepulchral warship home. When Sautekh returned, the Necrons were already stirring. Dynasties had risen, each pursuing its own destiny. Some fought amongst themselves, others waged war of reclamation against the Imperium and the Eldar. The galaxy was reeling from the opening of the Great Rift, and chaos spilled across the stars in a tide of demons and heresy. The Silent King saw that the galaxy was as fractured as the dynasties themselves, and he understood what must be done. The Necrons had waited 60 million years to reclaim their empire, but they would never succeed divided. They needed unity, and only he could provide it. Yet Sautekh was no tyrant. He did not seek to restore the protocols that had once bound every Necron to his command. He knew too well the price of that mistake. Instead, he moved like a shadow, accompanied by his Triarch Praetorians, awakening tombs where his presence would not be resisted, planting the seeds of loyalty where ambition might otherwise tear dynasties apart. In some places he revealed himself openly. The Silent King returned to lead his people once more. In others, he allowed whispers to spread before him, subtle manipulations that bent events towards his designs. He was a sovereign remade, not absolute ruler but an orchestrator, nudging his kindred toward a greater cause. Imperial records first marked his presence in scattered fragments, reports of Necron armies behaving with coordination beyond the usual dynastic rivalries, campaigns that spanned multiple sectors with eerie precision, and most famously, the War of Gehenna, where the Blood Angels under Commander Dante fought a desperate struggle against a vast Necron host. For weeks the battle raged, neither side yielding. Then the Tyranids descended, a swarm hungry to devour both armies. What followed stunned Imperial survivors. The Necrons did not press their attack, they turned their weapons upon the Tyranids. For a brief, impossible moment, the Sons of Sanguinius and the legions of Sautekh fought side by side, annihilating the alien swarm in a storm of bolter fire and emerald beams. When the last Tyranid fell, both sides stared across a field of carnage, and neither chose to resume their slaughter. Sautekh withdrew, leaving Dante alive, a decision as pragmatic as it was chilling. For the Silent King had no intention of wasting strength when greater threats loomed. Among his own kind, Sautekh's return was not universally welcome. Many overlords had grown accustomed to their independence. Imhotep the Stormlord, in particular, viewed himself as the rightful architect of the Necron resurgence. To acknowledge the Silent King's authority was to diminish his own, and he would not allow it. Thus the return of Sautekh ignited not only wars against the younger races, but also simmering conflict within Necron society. Skirmishes broke out between dynasties, proxy wars where loyalty to the Silent King was tested in fire. Some swore allegiance, recognising his wisdom and long memory. Others resisted, clinging to pride and ambition. The Necrons had always been fractured, and Zarek's challenge was to transform that weakness into unity, without resorting to the tyranny he had forsworn. Despite resistance, Zarek pressed forward. His vision extended far beyond simple conquest. He sought nothing less than to reshape the galaxy itself, to exercise the influence of the warp and leave only the cold, material order of reality. To achieve this, he oversaw projects of staggering scale, chief among them the creation of null fields and blackstone constructs capable of deadening the immaterium. If completed, such works could choke the chaos from the galaxy, severing psychers from their power and ending demonic incursions forever. To mankind, this would be disaster, for the entire Imperium depended on the warp for travel and communication. To the Necrons, it was a salvation, a universe purged of the psychic plague that had nearly destroyed them in the War in Heaven. Imperial commanders began to recognise the pattern. Where the Silent King moved, warp storms stilled. Psychers reported their powers faltering. The living grew sluggish, their wills dulled, while Necron legions advanced unhindered. These were not isolated battles of conquest but steps in a grand design, a tightening grip upon reality itself. And behind it all, Zarek remained silent, watching with eyes that had seen stars born and die, guiding his people toward a destiny only he fully comprehended. The return of the Silent King was more than the reappearance of a sovereign. It was the reawakening of purpose. For the first time since the War in Heaven, the Necrons had a chance to be more than scattered lords clutching at fragments of memory. They had a king who remembered their glory, who carried the weight of their sins and sought to redeem their future. Whether redemption would come through domination or restoration mattered little to Zarek. What mattered was survival, of his people, of their empire, and perhaps even the galaxy itself, remade in the image of cold order. And so the dynasties stirred to his call, even as others resisted. The Imperium whispered of him in fear, the Eldar cursed his name as the return of the most ancient foe, and the Tyranids, mindless in hunger, spread ever closer, the very threat that had drawn him back. In the darkening days of the 41st millennium, when the galaxy split beneath the maw of the Great Rift, the Silent King returned not as a relic of the past, but as an architect of the future. The question was not whether Zarek could restore the Necron Empire, it was whether anything else could survive once he did. The return of the Silent King and the rising strength of the dynasties did not happen in isolation. The galaxy into which the Necrons awakened was one already tearing itself apart. The opening of the Great Rift split the Imperium in half, swallowing entire star systems into psychic storms and casting others into silence. To mortals, it was an age of desperation. To the Necrons, it was an opportunity. Where others saw chaos and collapse, the Necrons saw an unravelling of their rivals, and the weakening of the very forces that had once denied them victory. And so, war began again. Not the fragmented raids of scattered tombs, but coordinated campaigns of reclamation, assaults on a galactic scale, a war for dominion renewed. The Necrons were no longer content with isolated victories. Entire sectors were engulfed by their return. Their warships, crescent-shaped and gliding with spectral silence, emerged from hidden tomb fleets buried in dead systems, striking without warning. On a dozen fronts at once, planets that had stood under the Imperium's banner for millennia suddenly trembled as legions of living metal rose from beneath their crusts. Civilizations built in ignorance of their foundations discovered too late that their homes had always been tombs, waiting for the hour of awakening. No pleas for mercy could sway the Necrons, for in their minds these worlds were not conquests at all, they were inheritances, being taken back from trespassers. Among the most chilling of these campaigns was the Orpheus War. Entire guard armies marched into battle against endless ranks of Necron phalanxes, only to vanish without a trace. Vox transmissions captured desperate last words, orders to hold the line drowned in static, the screams of psychers silenced in a tide of null energy, the final words of generals proclaiming defiance against an enemy that did not answer. When Imperial reinforcements eventually arrived, they found system after system utterly lifeless, its populations erased, its cities hollow shells under emerald skies. The Orpheus sector, once home to billions, had become a wasteland of silence, as though the galaxy itself had been claimed by death. This was not simple conquest, it was war on a scale that blurred the line between battle and extermination. The Necron brought forth technologies unseen since the War in Heaven. Blackstone pylons rose from the ground like jagged spears, severing warp travel, nullifying psychic power, and leaving Imperial defenders blind and cut off. Monolithic constructs the size of mountains scoured the battlefield with waves of entropic energy. Great pyramids of necrodermis descended from the void, disgorging legions of warriors in perfect ranks, each step a metronome of inevitability. Resistance was crushed with precision that many survivors claimed the Necrons had foreseen every move before it was made, as though the war was less a contest than an execution. The Imperium was forced to adapt, but adaptation came with bitter lessons. The strength of the Adeptus Astartes was tested repeatedly, from Ultramarines struggling to hold Damnos a second time, to Blood Angels clashing with dynasties that fought not for conquest but for sport. Even the might of Titans and the vast armadas of the Imperial Navy found themselves strained against the Necron weapons that could slice through adamantium plating like parchment. Again and again, Imperial commanders realised that brute strength alone could not win. Victory, when it came, relied on attrition, on sabotaging tomb complexes before they fully awakened, or on alliances of desperation with the Eldar. The Imperium did not fight to triumph, it fought to endure, praying that the Necrons' disunity would last long enough to prevent annihilation. Yet disunity did not mean weakness. The dynasties, though fractious, pressed forward relentlessly. Some sought to reclaim ancient star maps and celestial orreries, devices capable of manipulating the very lifeblood of systems. In one notorious instance, a Necron overlord activated an orrery and extinguished a sun with a gesture, watching an entire system collapse into darkness as though conducting a symphony of ruin. Others deployed world-ending constructs like the World Engine, a planet-sized fortress that cut a swath of destruction across Imperial space until the Blood Angels sacrificed entire companies to destroy it. Such horrors served not only as acts of conquest but as demonstrations of power, reminders to all living races that the Necrons were masters of reality itself. For the Eldar, the renewal of the war was a nightmare out of memory. Their seers had long whispered of the return of the ancient foe, and now those prophecies were fulfilled. Craft worlds launched strike forces across the stars, desperately attempting to halt awakenings before they could spread. But the Necrons were too many, and their tombs too deeply buried, their awakening too widespread to contain. Even when Eldar victories were won, they were fleeting, for every tomb silence saw another stir in its place. To the Eldar, it was not simply a war but the rekindling of the war in heaven itself, a reminder that their people's survival was never secure. Amid this chaos, the Silent King directed his own vision. He did not seek reckless conquest but strategic transformation. The Pariah Nexus became the most visible example of his ambition, a network of blackstone constructs stretching across the Nephilim sector, designed to sever the warp's influence entirely. Within these zones, psykers fell silent, demons withered, and Imperial worlds descended into eerie stillness. Populations grew passive, drained of their will, their resistance evaporating before Necron phalanxes. For the Imperium, the Pariah Nexus was a strategic calamity, a hole carved in the very fabric of the Emperor's domain, and they fought with all their strength to reclaim it. But for the Necrons, it was proof that their vision was possible. If the galaxy could be remade into a realm without the warp, then chaos itself could be starved to death. The wars that followed were not uniform. Some dynasties clashed openly with the Imperium, slaughtering billions in campaigns of conquest. Others turned inward, waging war against rival dynasties or pursuing obscure relics of the past. Yet the overall effect was unmistakable. The Necrons were no longer a forgotten threat. They had become one of the dominant powers of the age, their army standing alongside Chaos, Orcs, Tyranids, and humanity itself as contenders of the galaxy's fate. Every engagement proved the same lesson, that the Necrons could not be eradicated, that every victory against them was temporary, and that time was their ally. For the Imperium, these renewed wars became yet another front in a galaxy already aflame. Worlds that had stood law for 10,000 years fell in days. Fleets that had weathered Orc wars and Chaos crusades crumbled before the Necron Gore storms. And still, the threat was not fully understood. Even within the High Lords of Terror, debate raged over what the Necrons truly wanted. Were they exterminators? Were they conquerors? Or did they seek something deeper, an order that no human mind could grasp? The only certainty was that they would not stop. In the grim darkness of the 41st millennium, the war for the galaxy was renewed. And this time it was not simply a contest of armies but eras. The Imperium represented the fragility of the present, Chaos the madness of the warp, the Tyranids the hunger of the void, and the Necrons the inevitability of the past rising again. The dynasties had stirred, the Silent King had returned, and the galaxy stood on the brink of another war in heaven. There are places in the galaxy where the very air seems heavy, where sound is dulled, where thought itself feels sluggish, and even the brightest flame of will burns faint and cold. To humanity, these places became known as zones of despair, but to the Necrons they were the harbingers of a new age. The Pariah Nexus was not a single world or a single battle, but an unfolding phenomenon, a vast network of nullfields and blackstone constructs stretching across systems, designed to unmake the warp's influence. In these regions, the Immaterium fell silent, psykers lost their gifts, and demons were unable to cross the veil. To the Imperium it was calamity, to the Necrons it was vindiction, a glimpse of the order they had sought since the war in heaven. The idea was ancient, carried across millennia from the earliest experiments of the Cryptex. The warp had always been their greatest enemy. It was the Old One's tool, the weapon that had thwarted Necron conquest in the Dawn Age. Even after the war in heaven, the warp had proven its danger, spawning entities that feasted on pain and flooding the galaxy with instability. To the Necrons, victory could never be complete until the Immaterium itself was severed from reality. The Pariah Nexus was their answer, and under the guidance of Sautekh and his most brilliant cryptex, it became reality. Entire sectors began to dim. Astropaths screamed as their connections were severed, their voices cut from the choir of the Astronomicon. Ships attempting to navigate through the warp found their courses disrupted, their Gellerfields flickering as the tides of the Immaterium ebbed unnaturally. On the ground, psychers collapsed into silence, their minds stripped of the very essence that made them conduits. In some places, populations fell into unnatural torpor, their wills drained by a suffocating pressure they could not name. Resistance to Necron advance crumbled without a shot fired. The defenders of these systems were still men and women of flesh, but they fought as though drugged, their spirits crushed before the first emerald beam lit the battlefield. Imperial investigators soon realised the scope of the catastrophe. What seemed at first like a new form of weapon was in truth an entire lattice of blackstone pylons parried across worlds, awakening in sequence to spread their deadening influence. These were not crude tools of battle but intricate engines of reality, seeded across the Nephilim sector and beyond. At their heart stood constructs larger than mountains, their surfaces inscribed with glyphs that no human lex mechanic could pass, each line a part of a cosmic equation written by minds millions of years old. To dismantle even a fragment was an undertaking requiring entire crusades, and by the time Imperial forces had destroyed one, 3 more had already activated. The battles that erupted in the Nexus were unlike any the Imperium had faced. Every psyker deployed into the battlefield became a liability. Librarians of the Adeptus Astartes found themselves unable to summon their powers, reduced to warriors of flesh and steel alone. The Sisters of Battle discovered that even their fervent faith dulled in the stilling aura, their zeal crushed by a silence deeper than doubt. Even Inquisitors, hardened against horrors, found themselves struggling to marshal resistance. Armies entered the Nexus as cohesive fighting forces and dissolved into sluggish mobs, bewildered by the suffocating quiet that pressed down upon their souls. Against them marched Necron legions utterly unaffected, their machine minds untroubled by the absence of warp echoes. It was as though the very battlefield had been designed for their perfection. Imperial commandos fought desperately to contain the spread. The Indomitus Crusade diverted entire battle groups to the region, led by tech priest Dominus Belisarius Cawl himself, seeking to dismantle the great engines of nullification. The Necrons, however, had no intention of allowing their work to be undone. Dynasties aligned where they had once feuded, bound by the promise of a galaxy cleansed of chaos. To them, the Nexus was not simply strategy, it was destiny, a tool to finish what had been started in the War in Heaven. And so the battles of the Nephilim sector became wars of annihilation, not only between human and Necron, but between Necron and Necron, as dynasties clashed over who would claim dominion over the heart of the project. Imhotep the Stormlord, unwilling to bow to the Silent King, committed his Sautekh hosts against Zarek's allies in the region. In the midst of Imperial bloodshed, Necron war hosts turn upon each other, their scything beams and gore storms tearing through their own kind with as much further as they did their enemies. For Imperial soldiers, it was a bewildering sight. Machine legions that had butchered their comrades in silence suddenly redirecting their wrath upon other metallic armies, fighting with the same mechanical perfection yet offering no explanation. To some commanders it was a reprieve, to others it was a nightmare. For once one side had triumphed, it always turned its gaze back upon the mortals who still lingered in the field. The toll on the Imperium was staggering. Systems vanished from the Emperor's light, their populations either enslaved or extinguished. Astropathic silence spread across the region, cutting off communication with Segmentum Command. Worlds fell into despair as their prayers went unanswered, their faith faltering in the unnatural stillness. Yet even amid the tide of darkness, resistance endured. Crusades pressed deeper into the Nexus, fighting battle after battle among the lifeless landscapes where the warp had been strangled. Imperial saints were invoked, relics were carried into war, and in some places the sheer weight of human defiance slowed the advance, but slowing was all they could hope for. For the Necrons, the Pariah Nexus was not yet complete. It was a fragment of a greater design, an experiment on a scale vast enough to reshape reality itself. If extended to the galaxy entire, the warp would fall silent everywhere. No demon would cross into real space, no cycle would wield unnatural might, and chaos itself would starve. To mortals this seemed impossible, the fever dream of an ancient people. To Zarekh and his cryptex, it was not only possible, but inevitable. They had created an empire that defied time. Why should they not also create a galaxy that defied madness? And so the wars of the Nexus continued, grinding and endless, fought in silence deeper than the grave. For the Imperium, it was a wound that bled hope. For the Necrons, it was the first step in the rebirth of eternity. Across the darkening stars the message was clear. The Undying were not merely reclaiming their empire, they were reshaping the very fabric of existence to suit their vision, and nothing the younger races could do seemed enough to halt the march of inevitability. Long before the Imperium ever learned to fear the Necrons, Zarekh had already witnessed the approach of a terror greater than anything humanity could comprehend. Out in the darkness between galaxies, where he had drifted in exile for countless millennia, the Silent King saw them coming. He watched the first tendrils of the Great Devourer stretching across the void, consuming everything in its path. These were not invaders like the Orcs, not demons birthed of the warp, not fragile empires like the Eldar or the Tau. They were hunger incarnate, a will without mercy or reason, and they would not stop until every shred of organic matter in the galaxy had been consumed. To the Silent King, the Tyranids were the one threat that could end not only his people, but all existence that had meaning. When he returned from exile, he brought with him this knowledge, and it became one of the driving forces behind his campaign to reforge the Necron dynasties. To him, it mattered little whether mankind held half the stars or whether the Eldar clung to their shattered remnants of an empire. In time, all would be swallowed by the swarm unless the Necrons acted. For this reason, he began to shape his kindred toward an unthinkable goal, the unification of the dynasties that had been enemies for 60 million years. Only together could they hope to withstand the tide that came from beyond the stars. The first true test came at Gehenna, where the Blood Angels and their allies clashed with the vast Necron force under Surek's command. The Tyranids descended upon the battlefield in the midst of the war, a tide of Chitin and Fang, blotting out the sun with their endless numbers. The Necrons fought with the same merciless efficiency they always had, but here their weapons found true purpose. Where Gor's fire met the Tyranid carapace, it did not simply kill, it annihilated, stripping the very molecules from the swarm, ensuring nothing remained for the Hive fleets to reclaim. To the Imperials, it was a sight at once horrifying and miraculous. And for a brief moment, the impossible occurred. Man and Necron fought side by side, their combined strength breaking the back of the Tyranid onslaught. When the field was finally quiet, the Blood Angels expected the Necrons to resume their attack. Instead, Zarek withdrew, his forces vanishing into the void. He had not come to exterminate the Imperium that day. He had come to test his strength against the Devourer. For the Necrons, the Tyranids are a paradoxical enemy. On one hand, they are the ultimate expression of the organic, a living tide that cannot be reasoned with, that cannot be corrupted, that cannot be enslaved. They are in many ways the embodiment of everything the Necrons despise. Impermanent, ravenous, breeding endlessly without regard for order or reason. And yet, they are also the one enemy that the Necrons truly fear. Unlike mankind, unlike the Eldar, unlike the green-skinned hordes, the Tyranids cannot be waited out. Time is meaningless to them. They advance without pause, consuming everything in their path. And even the immortality of the Necrons cannot shield them if the galaxy itself is stripped bare. Dynasties have already felt the sting of this threat. Entire tomb worlds have been consumed, their surface layers stripped away before their defences could fully awaken. In some instances, canaptic constructs held the Tyranids at bay long enough for the legions to rise, but in others, the Necrons emerge into battlefields already drowned in chittering forms. When the Necrons prevail, they do so with their typical cold precision, dissecting the swarm in waves of disciplined fire and counterattack. But when they falter, the result is horrific. A tomb that slumbers too long, a pylon network that fails to ignite, and the Tyranids devour it all, erasing millions of years of preparation in days. This is why Zarek's forces become insistent, why his campaigns carry a sense of urgency rare among his people. He does not merely seek to restore the Infinite Empire out of pride or nostalgia. He seeks to forge a bulwark strong enough to withstand the hunger of the void. To him, the Pariah Nexus and the nullification of the warp are not just ways to deny chaos, they are weapons against the Tyranids as well. A galaxy stripped of psychic resonance is a galaxy less appetising to the hive mind, a reality where the swarms might find themselves weakened, their cohesion frayed. It is a gamble, a desperate dream, but to the Silent King it may be the only chance left. The Imperium, for all its ignorance of the Necron motives, has begun to notice strange patterns in Tyranid conflicts. Hive fleets that once devoured worlds unchallenged now encounter resistance not only from humanity, but from the legions of living metal. On some battlefields, Imperial soldiers retreat under cover of Necron fire, bewildered by the unspoken truce. On others, both sides are annihilated, the Necrons refusing to abandon even a scrap of ground to the swarm. Reports filter back of impossible victories, where a single dynasty obliterates a tendril of a Hive fleet, leaving nothing but drifting debris. These stories spread quickly, and in some corners of the Imperium there are even whispers, heretical, dangerous whispers, that perhaps the Necrons are the only force capable of halting the Devourer's advance. But to ally with the Undying would be madness. The Necrons care nothing for humanity's survival. Every battle they fight against the Tyranids is fought not for mankind's sake, not for mercy, but for the survival of their own kind and the fulfilment of their vision. Once the Tyranids are broken, the Necrons will turn their gaze back to reclaiming their empire, and the Imperium again will be trespassers standing upon Necron soil. For the Silent King, this is no contradiction. He seeks to preserve the galaxy not for humanity, not for the Eldar, not for any of the younger races. He seeks to preserve it for the Necrons alone. Still, the shadows of the Tyranids stretches even wider. Each hive fleet that emerges from the void brings with it countless billions of organisms, each one a weapon, each one a fragment of hunger that cannot be sated. To fight them requires not only strength but endless endurance, and though the Necrons are eternal, they are not infinite. Even Sautekh knows this. He has seen worlds fall, dynasties erased, entire legions ground to nothing in the feeding swarms. And he knows that unless his people unite, unless they complete the work of reforging their empire, they will eventually be swept aside like all the rest. Thus, the war with the Tyranids is not only a battle for survival, it is a crucible. It is the fire in which the Necrons must prove themselves worthy of the eternity they claim. Every clash with the Swarm is a reminder of what is at stake, a test of their weapons, their strategies, and their resolve. And every victory, no matter how costly, is a message to the galaxy. The Necrons do not fear extinction. They will not yield to the hunger of the void. They are the Undying, and they will fight until the stars themselves go dark. Yet even the Silent King knows that the outcome is uncertain. For all his vision, for all his schemes, he cannot yet say whether the galaxy belongs to the Necrons reborn, or whether it is destined to become nothing more than sustenance for the Devourer. The galaxy trembles beneath the weight of countless wars, yet for the Necrons there is clarity to it all. The Imperium flounders, stretched across too many fronts, its Emperor corpse-bound to a throne. The Eldar dwindle with every passing century, a shadow of their ancient power. Orcs rampage without purpose, chaos embodied in flesh. Chaos itself floods the stars, howling through the wound in reality, gnawing at the edges of everything. And from beyond the galactic rim, the Tyranids come in endless waves. To the younger races, this is apocalypse. To the Necrons, it is inevitability. But inevitability need not mean defeat. Not for those that have already conquered time itself. For the Necrons, this age of fire and ruin is not an ending, it is a beginning. In the cold logic of Sautekh's mind, all of these foes are distractions. What matters is not who claims this planet or that star system. What matters is the grand design, the restoration of reality stripped of the warp, ordered and absolute. It is a dream born of bitterness, forged in the betrayal of the star gods and the horror of biotransference. The Necrons sacrificed everything for eternity, only to discover eternity alone was not enough. What they crave now is permanence, not simply to endure while the galaxy collapses around them, but to sculpt that galaxy into a form where collapse is impossible. To understand this purpose is to understand why the Necrons rise with such patience. Every war they wage, every tomb world that stirs, every pylon that hums with awakening energy, it all points towards the same goal. They are not content to be conquerors. Conquests fade, empires rise and fall, even the Imperium, vast as it is, will crumble in the face of time. But the Necrons are not bound by time. They seek to engineer a galaxy where nothing ephemeral reigns, a galaxy without the warp, without chaos, without the weakness of flesh, a galaxy of order, a galaxy that cannot decay. The Pariah Nexus was only the first step. Across uncounted systems, Cryptek's work to expand its principles, weaving networks of Blackstone and arcane machinery that can choke psychic resonance, quiet the howling madness of the Immaterium, and leave only the cold precision of material universe. Imagine, if such works were extended to the galactic scale, no more demons clawing into reality, no more sorcerers tearing holes in existence, no more hive fleets guided by the psychic beacon of the hive mind. The warp itself would become a husk, and with its death, so too would die the great threats that rely upon it. To mortals this is horror, to the Necrons it is salvation. But beneath this vast purpose lies another, quieter yearning. Though they rarely admit it, even to themselves, many Necrons still remember fragments of their old lives, a face half recalled, a name that no longer fits upon their tongues, a sensation of warmth they cannot feel but cannot forget. Biotransference stripped them of their souls, yet it did not wholly erase their memory. For Sautekh's most of all, this is the wound that drives him. He cannot undo what was done, but perhaps he can make it matter. If the Necrons can create a galaxy of perfect order, perhaps that sacrifice, the loss of flesh, the shattering of spirit, will finally be redeemed. And yet, the Silent King is not alone in his vision. Other dynasties dream their own dreams. Some hunger for domination, eager to enslave the younger races as chattel, a reminder of the galaxy's true masters. Others dream of extermination, a clean sweep of all imperfections so that only metal endures. And still others, in rare moments of dangerous brilliance, whisper of reversing biotransference, of reclaiming what was lost, of remaking themselves as lords of flesh once more. These dreams conflict, they collide, and they drive Necron against Necron even as they march upon the galaxy together. The final purpose is not yet decided. It is still being written, in blood and in silence, in battles fought across a million stars. The Imperium, for all its ignorance, senses the weight of this moment. Every report of a Necron awakening carries the same dread. These are not simply Xenos incursions, they are echoes of an older war, a war humanity does not truly understand. To the Inquisition, the danger is almost beyond comprehension. If the Necrons succeed in their grand work, it will not simply be the end to chaos, it will be the end to mankind's ability to travel, to communicate, to exist as it has. Their order is not humanity's salvation, it is its suffocation. And so the Imperium fights, not only to preserve its stars, but to preserve their very disorder upon which it relies. The Eldar understand the truth more deeply. They know the Necrons of old, the ones who fought their ancestors in the war in heaven. To them, the resurgence of dynasties is not a mystery but a terror confirmed. They see in Zarek's vision the end of their dwindling race, for without the warp, without their psychic gifts, the Eldar are nothing. Their gods are dead, their empire shattered, and if the Necrons succeed, even their souls will find no refuge. This is why the Eldar seers whisper not of victory but of delay, of buying time, of surviving long enough that perhaps the Necrons will falter. And through it all, the Necrons march on. They do not waver, they do not tire. They cannot be reasoned with, cannot be corrupted, cannot be bribed. They are not like the Orcs, whose rage can be turned upon themselves. They are not like the Chaos, which feeds upon weakness. They are not like mankind, fractured by politics and faith. They are something older, colder, and more enduring. They are inevitability given form. What then is the final purpose of the Necrons? To restore the infinite empire? To extinguish all life but their own? To unmake the warp? To reclaim lost flesh? Perhaps it is all of these, or none. Perhaps even Zarek, for all his wisdom, cannot yet say. What is certain is the Necrons will not stop. Their patience is infinite, their resolve unshakable, their hunger for restoration as vast as the stars themselves. The galaxy burns, the younger races flail, and yet the Necrons endure, silent and inexorable. In the grim darkness of the far future, the Imperium speaks often of hope, of faith, of survival against impossible odds. But against the Necrons, hope means little. Faith means nothing. The only certainty is this: the Undying have returned, and they will not rest until their final purpose is fulfilled. Whether that purpose remakes the galaxy or ends it forever, only time will tell. And time, as always, belongs to them. You have heard the signal of Dominissimo Voxlor, carried on the current of eternity itself. The tomb doors close, the stasis fields hum, and the legions of the Undying return to their silent watch. Until the next awakening, strike the seal of subscription and join us again when the stars themselves tremble with the march of history. Remember this: flesh fails, empires fall, but the Necrons endure.